Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris here with another episode of Further Upstream. I'm joined again today by Tim Padgett, our Colson Center theologian in residence, and he's here to talk more with me about my recent discussion with Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman at the 2022 Wilberforce Weekend in Orlando, Florida. And of course, these two remarkable individuals were jointly recipients of the 2022 Wilberforce Award for the courageous stand that they've made really over the course of the last over a decade on behalf of religious freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, a fight that's taken them all the way to the highest court in the land. And I also was joined for this discussion by ADF attorney Matt Sharp, who was really helpful in illuminating kind of the legal aspects of all of this. So Tim, thanks for joining me. I think there's a lot more to talk about here. Specifically, I want to delve into the limits of religious freedom and whether the concept of coexistence has really held up under the new reign of sexual ideology. So Tim, welcome back to Further Upstream. It's great to have you.
Thanks. It's good to be back. I think that listening to the conversation you had, my very favorite part was when Barronelle Stutzman gave you grief at several points for being a sheltered little homeschool boy there.
She called me sheltered for, I believe, being amazed that people ever order divorce cakes or divorce floral arrangements. And that's a thing apparently people do that she was not interested in participating in. I guess Jack was not either. But these two had a whole list of things that they were in agreement with sheltered homeschoolers on, that they were not going to bake cakes that celebrated sort of profanity or obscenity. They weren't going to have cakes that depicted pornographic things. Jack would not bake a cake that sort of celebrated Halloween. Barronelle would not arrange flowers for certain events. They had a lot of different sort of compunctions, right? And it wasn't like they were singling out gay weddings or events that celebrated, shall we say, alternative sexualities as something they wouldn't do. They were both approached by individuals who wanted this sort of thing. And I think, really to kick us off here, I want to just note how winsome and I think careful both of these individuals were. I could imagine a scenario where someone with traditional convictions, maybe even a Christian, receives that kind of request and says something like, get out of here. I don't do that garbage. I'm not going to celebrate your sin, whatever. That kind of gruff response. I have relatives who would respond that way, right? But Jack and Barronelle did not respond that way. They responded with I think an abundance of love and caution. And it illustrates for me the first point here, which is that there's no amount of winsomeness that can get you out of these battles, right? When I opened up the discussion, I talked about how you may not take an interest in politics, but politics will take an interest in you. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Jack and Barronelle. So what do you think about the whole winsome thing and as a strategy versus as just a duty?
Yeah, I actually agree very much on that about their winsomeness. I remember at Wilberforce where you had this conversation. This is a month ago or more now. And I remember seeing Jack Phillips walk around the hall and seeing him there in the main hall with his wife and kids and whatnot. And there was no, I'm a culture warrior. I'm standing. I'm doing this. He was just an ordinary guy. He was just there with his kids, talking to his kids. He was humble, not in the sense of self-effacing. He wasn't talking himself down and like that. And I actually went up at one point and thanked him for his courage. And it wasn't even an aw shucks, but almost that. But it's almost as, he's the one who is being honored here at this, along with Barronelle Stutzman, being honored here at this big conference with how many people were in that room? 1,000 people to honor him. And he didn't seem to think it was all that significant. And not that he didn't appreciate the honor, nor did he fail to recognize the importance of what he was doing. It was like, he's just being himself. And I loved that about them. Almost there was one point of contrast between the two. I remember listening to your conversation where he said he'd listed out ahead of time, here are the things we're not going to do. We're not going to do Halloween. We're not going to do pornography. We're not going to do thus and such. He thought it out ahead of time. Whereas with Barronelle Stutzman, I remember she said it hadn't occurred to her that this was going to be a controversial issue. And so you see these two elements where he had thought it out, like here's how we're going to respond to various issues. And her, not that she hadn't thought about things, but she was so rooted in her faith. So both of them, one being a little more proactive and the other just following the faith, each of them demonstrated this simple faith, which was just amazing to me. That's the right sort of winsomeness. We've seen the battles on Twitter in the last few months about winsomeness and whatnot. And it's a bit of a frustrating thing because it's almost like this polarized conversation where either you're winsome or you're antagonistic, where either we judge our proper response to the world by whether they like us, that we're doing right if they like us. And on the other hand, you had lots of people who seem to think that the way you know that you're being righteous and faithful to God is if the world is throwing things at you. Well, that's not exactly it either. We have to accept that no matter how winsome we are, that the world will hate us in the church. If we stand in faithfulness, as Barronelle and Jack did, if we stand in faithfulness, the world's going to come at us. But that doesn't mean we need to go out of our way to cause the world to come at us. And a lot of people, too much of the time, they seem to have this attitude that I only know if I'm being faithful if I'm incurring insults and things like that.
Well, you see both attitudes where there's some who say, only if I'm incurring insults can I conclude I'm being faithful. And then the other attitude is, if I am incurring insults, if I am incurring the sort of ire of the secular world, then I must not be faithful. Or you must not be faithful. That's a mark of your failure to do so. And I think that's the value for me of this slogan or this saying that I guess John Stonestreet came up with that. I forget exactly where it originated, but a few years ago, we were, saying a lot that winsomeness is not a strategy, that loving your neighbor is not a strategy, that being Christ-like is not a strategy. It's actually just obedience. It's actually just what you're commanded to do, regardless of what the cultural or social ramifications of that are. So if you avoid conflicts, if a gentle answer turns away wrath, like the Psalm or the Proverbs say, then yeah, so much the better. That's the way things often tend to work. But if it doesn't work that way, if they sue you, if they take you to the state courts and then all the way to the Supreme Court eventually, trying to get you shut down for not doing what they wanted you to do, unfailingly, Jack and Barronelle were winsome. And I think they did the right thing. And I don't think the fact that they weren't able to sort of make nice with their clients through their winsomeness is a failure. I think it's actually they succeeded as Christians in their witness for doing that. And so that's why it's so important to me to point that out, that this isn't the strategy. It's not something we're doing in order to bring about utilitarian end. It's actually just something we do out of obedience, come what may.
Yeah, I remember one example I like to use when having this sort of discussion is that you think of the contrasting examples of John the Baptist and Jesus. John the Baptist is out there calling people, all sorts of names, and he's this kind of crazy figure, antagonistic to the culture, antagonistic to the authorities. Jesus is out there not only dining with the sinners we think of, the prostitutes and the tax collectors, but he's also dining with the Pharisees. He's being very much more conciliatory in all sorts of ways. But this world killed them both. And I think that's something we got to remember. There's no guaranteed activity, style that's going to win us a hearing with the world. I think you've heard me say here on the Colson Center that the goal isn't to be balanced, but to be centered. It's not about finding that right tactic that's going to accomplish us the right goal. It's to be faithful. And as we say here at the Colson Center also, faithfulness, not success. And I think these two are great examples of faithfulness, not success. Now, they had each in their own way found both success and failure in the court systems, as the lawyer was talking about, that it was there's kind of a trajectory towards liberty in these matters. But their goal is not to win the court case. Their goal is to be faithful, even if they lose. And that's it was just a beautiful example of that.
It got me wondering as we had this discussion at Wilberforce, and then as I prepped for this discussion today with you, what exactly the limits of this sort of religious freedom claim are. And obviously, Jack's case, for instance, which went to the Supreme Court, it was decided in his favor, but it was sort of a narrow decision or it was narrow in scope, not in the number of justices, but it was a narrow decision in that they kind of just told the Colorado Civil Rights Commission to knock it off and stop harassing this guy for his faith. They didn't make any sort of broad declarations about religious freedom or freedom of expression or artistic freedoms or anything like that. So we're still kind of waiting for that case. But in light of that gap in the court's ruling, I wonder what your thoughts are on the limits of religious freedom, because I often hear caricatures of this, that well, if Jack's not going to bake a cake for a gay wedding, he's not going to put together this artistic confection to celebrate something he believes is fundamentally wrong, then why can't someone with a prejudice that progressives consider on equal footing refuse to do something or refuse a service? Why doesn't that devolve into like the lunch counters of the Jim Crow South? And that's I'm being devil's advocate here. What are your thoughts on that and the limits of this claim?
That is a very good question, and we get it very often here at the Colson Center. And it's a hard question. And I think it shows the problem of a society operating without an overarching worldview. It's like the quote about, was it the John Adams quote about, our Constitution was made for a moral people and it won't work for anyone else. And that's very true. The ideas of liberty, the ideas of freedom of conscience, these work when you have a basically moral society. We do see the abuses that come with this. We see the examples of criminals clearly guilty of everything they've been accused of, getting away on a technicality, getting away because they're Miranda rights or whatever it is, getting away because of the police had acted in an inappropriate way and getting the information about them for the trial. We do see that with liberty and law and the laws there to protect those liberties, there come places where it really doesn't work, where because there's no moral grounding, because there's no standard higher than legality, higher than can I get away with this, people do and commit all sorts of moral failings, things that aren't technically crimes because it's legal, but there are moral failings nonetheless. It's like the distinction between a sin and a crime. One of my favorite stories was hearing Chuck Colson when he met with the Harvard Business School back 20 more years ago, talking about how the problem of teaching ethics at Harvard Business School, because for all of its academic credentials, they have denied any sort of overarching moral standard. With that, they don't have an answer to the CEOs, the Enrons of the world, the CEOs who want to skirt on things because it's legal. And I think that's one of the problems we're running into with this issue is because we don't have a category. Our society has dropped the category of moral wrong. We've only allowed the category of socially acceptable and politically legal. So again, another Colson quote of the conscience and the constable, that we are arriving at the point, we see that point that people will, because of their moral failings as a culture and as individuals, they're going to try to get away with stuff. And there will be abuses. And there will be things like that. And it's awful. This is bad. It is wicked that people would take advantage of legalities, that they take advantage of the fact of freedom of speech to have pornography, which is so destructive. We have advantages of legal loopholes and insurance companies who they just screw over their clients. And I think it's that gap between legality and morality. The state doesn't really have an answer for it. So when we encounter things like this, I think there's a couple things going on. We have to deal with the fact that politics can't save us. We're not going to come up with a political solution to the problem of humanity. That the corruptions that are in the human heart are going to manifest themselves, and the state can only do so much. There are going to be people who take advantage of the pluralism and the freedom that we have in this culture to say all sorts of hateful, mean-spirited, evil things. That is going to happen. And there's going to be a place where we can't quite lock it down with the right legislation. Ultimately, we just have to recognize the limitations of the state.
So in other words, the First Amendment, for instance, which is where we'd ground the right to free speech and the freedom of religion and the press, protects things that aren't necessarily moral and potentially could protect types of discrimination or what might get labeled hate speech these days. And obviously, there are these sort of limits that have been circumscribed by the court over the years. So you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, that sort of thing. But there definitely are a lot of limits there. And many of our fellow Americans would look at what Jack Phillips did or what Barronelle Stutzman did and say, oh, they're actually wronging their neighbors by refusing to participate in a gay wedding and glorify that. So that falls under that umbrella of things that you may not agree with, but are actually protected. And there are many different, Westboro Baptist has a right to go and and spew the vile, filthy hatred that they do at soldiers' funerals, right? Because of the First Amendment. That's kind of been I don't know if there's been a specific ruling, but obviously they're still doing it. It's not legal challenges to it have failed. And the same sort of thing, applies to a dozen other examples we could name. The limits of religious freedom, though, are interesting to me, specifically as we begin to redefine reality. So what I mean by that is when you begin to say something like two men can be married, right? Isn't there a kind of zero sum between claims like that and religious claims or religious freedom, the presumptions and assumptions that got us along as a people before, like what marriage is, that marriage has a definition. Well, now we're going to make up a completely new definition of marriage, and everyone has to go along with it. If you don't want to go along with it, we're going to sort of persecute you in the courts. And thankfully there was a high, there were enough justices in the high court who said, no, back off, unelected Civil Rights Commission. You can't persecute this guy for his beliefs that literally everyone held until 5 minutes ago. But yeah, I'm wondering what you think about the irreconcilability of these claims, because it seems like there's a set pie, if you will, of freedom of speech and expression in religion. And not every claim can coexist and expect others to behave accordingly, with this pie, given this limited pie. And so we have to divvy it up between the claims of religious people who want to live according to their convictions and, say, gay couples who want to live according to their convictions, or transgender individuals who these new claims on reality say, I am this and therefore you have to do that for me, whether it's bake a cake or arrange flowers or take pictures or accommodate their ceremony or whatever it is. There are 1,000 examples we could come up with. What are the limits there, and what's the fundamental conflict?
Well, I think that some of the point you made in your conversation, I think it was when you were talking to Jack or maybe to Barronelle, the line from Carl Trueman talking about that there's this need for recognition in so much of this contemporary conflict over sexuality. And you think, just go back a few years. Basically, there's a libertarian argument for accepting homosexuality, because until relatively recently, it was on the books that that sodomy was not merely a sin but a crime. That made it even into there's something about Mary, the Ben Stiller movie, that was part of the punchline of one incident in there, that it was on the books at least. And the libertarian argument was, who cares what other people do in their bedrooms? Well, then it shifted from privacy, leave us alone in our own bedrooms, to legality. Let this be enshrined as an equal act with other sort of, natural marriage. But then now we see with these instances, that was something that actually I found remarkable, that both of them mentioned how quickly things turned, how quickly it went from let us live our lives as we want to live our lives as LGBT, et cetera, to you must participate. You must participate with us in what we do. You must recognize and endorse and affirm. And if you don't, I'm bringing the state. How quickly that changed. So you see the shift from, again, the libertarian idea, leave us alone, let us do what we want, we're not going to bother you, to we are equal to you must endorse us. And so I think that that's where the problem comes, is because it's this shift. It's kind of a pluralism rooted in relativism. Now, those aren't the same thing. Like, pluralism is multiple people having multiple ideas. That's life, okay? You and I are Christians. We might have Muslim neighbors, stuff like that. Pluralism is, we're not going to try to shut down their mosque. They're not going to try and shut down our church. Everybody gets along. Relativism says there's no difference and there's no good or bad or right and things like that. I think what we're seeing, progressivism, why there's the hostility here, why there is, as you say, that zero-sum game, is because it's a pluralism that's rooted in a relativism. It has the posture of pluralism, let everybody do their own thing, but it's rooted in this idea that nobody is more right than another. So you must tell me that I am right. And that's an irony, because it shifted from I'm going to let you, Shane, think what you want to think, to me saying you must tell me that I am right. And there really is a shift in that. You've seen a shift, particularly in the left in America, but in the right as well in many ways. I think you even mentioned this in the conversation about this shift from like an old school liberal. An old school liberal would have been the first to champion the right of people to have their own beliefs and not be persecuted by the state. The irony that I forget which one it was, that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, was prosecuting this case to demand that someone have coerced speech. The irony of that. And it shows the progression of within liberalism from once it was, let's break the chains to allow your natural humanity to go to be as it ought to be, to now it's simply progression, simply challenge, simply go. And it's a very different attitude. I do think you see this in primarily the left, at least it's more overt in the left, but I think in the right as well, because it's, you got to agree with me. I think this goes back to what we talked about earlier about the antagonism as a goal.
You remember those Coexist bumper stickers that you don't see them so much anymore, but they had all the different religious symbols, and there was Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and everything on there. You know, the idea was that we can all just get along. We can all live in a society together, tolerate and respect each other's beliefs, and it'll all be hunky-dory and kumbaya. You know, the irony of that on a couple of levels really always struck me. Number one is that it shows a lack of understanding of the claims of many of those faiths, and the fact that Christianity is actually the one primarily interested in tolerance and inclusion, and that some of the secular ideas by proxy, you know, have picked that up. But there are lots of religions in there that certainly don't have a historic interest in tolerance. But the most important point is that they make claims on people's lives. There are civic and political and behavioral claims that those faiths make that require a sort of submission. So, you know, if Islam takes over a country, they put in place a set of laws that are motivated by and informed by Islamic faith. There's an Islamic law, much like there was once a Hebrew law in the Mosaic dispensation under Israel. It controls aspects of behavior we would look at and say, that's the realm of just do what you want. You're free. No, not under that system. And so there's this great naivete behind the sticker that we can coexist, even though there are competing metaphysical and political and moral and, you know, claims about the basic facts of reality. We can't agree on those. And when you make contrary claims about reality, you actually are at loggerheads. You know, you hit that zero sum moment where you say you can behave this way. I say you can't. And if I get a majority of the voters on my side, then congratulations, you're under Sharia law. It doesn't work. I'm wondering, number one, do I not see those stickers as much because people have kind of realized, oh yeah, you know, ascendant expressive individualism and secularism actually does make demands on religious people that require that preclude coexistence. But I'm wondering at what point we realize that naivete. We realize as a people that we can't actually make claims about reality that are so fundamentally opposed and still live together, that living together no longer is the ideal. I don't even hear the LGBT rights activists talking about living together anymore. It's not a live and let live thing. It's you have to recognize my identity and celebrate it with me, participate in my pride and glorify it, or else you are attacking me. You're attacking my identity, denying my legitimacy, and causing me to be, you know, suicidal or whatever. The bar has moved from toleration to active celebration. Where do we go from there? Do we just continue to butt heads? Does the conflict intensify?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think the Coexist bumper stickers are they're the quintessential symbol of our age in many ways, because on the one hand, they claim to be all about tolerance. They claim to be all about let's all get along and about that we're all in basic agreement. One, it completely ignores, as you said, the fact that these groups, they don't agree. I mean, again, you and I as Christians, we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, God himself. If you're Muslim, you think of Jesus as a prophet, and you think that if you don't hold to the ideas of Muhammad, then you're lost. Then you've disconnected from God. Whereas we say, if you do hold to the ideas of Muhammad, then you're lost. And then in Judaism, they might grant to Jesus a title prophet, and I think many of them do, or as a great teacher and things like that, but they will not accept that he is the second person of the Trinity. And that's all within one basic family of religions. That's all Abrahamic monotheism. Then you get into Hinduism and Buddhism and so on. These groups don't agree. So you kind of have to gloss over And that's the thing. They do more than gloss over. They do more. The Coexist bumper sticker more than glosses over what these people believe. So, for instance, it's actually I think it was Dick Keyes. I think he was the one who told me this. He was at L'Abri in Boston for a good long while. And he talked about, I think we were having a discussion about this, and he said that the Coexist bumper sticker is actually an incredibly intolerant statement because it says, you must fit, all these diverse religions must fit into this nebulous blob of ideas where Christianity and Islam, they really teach the same thing. And they don't. The only way you can get Christianity and Islam to be teaching the same thing is by cutting off the edges that you don't like, which is to say, by dictating to people of faith what they must believe. And I think that, yes, when you do talk about such a fundamental thing as sexuality, we are in a place where there can't be exactly a let's get along. It's got to be that we're not going to come to an agreement on that. That someone who, when we say that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, barring the genetic anomaly sorts of situations, we say that that is part of nature and this is good and this is what we have to hold to. And it's not merely a physical fact, but it's a moral reality. And we talk to someone, a contemporary person today who says, no, this is not true. Both of those things can't be true. Both of those things can't fit together in an understanding of what marriage is.
And those things, those counterclaims compel actions by other people. That's what's so fatal to the sort of libertarian ideal of, or the toleration ideal of just living together, living and let live, coexist, is that you actually can't, where you come up against someone like a business owner in this case, so Jack and Barronelle, or something more profound like an adoption agency. Right? Are you going to, as an adoption agency, as a member of the team, as an employee, are you going to help place children with same-sex couples that you believe that's not a marriage, that's not a household, that their whole lives are built around sexual brokenness? Is that something you're going to do? Well, if the society as a whole adopts that, that set of metaphysical assumptions and says, yes, it is possible for two men to form a family, we're saying that's true now, then you have to recognize it. You have to place a child there. That now compels your actions. There is no live and let live. You have to give way before the new reigning dominant beliefs. And that's actually what we've seen, where Catholic adoption agencies, for instance, have been shut down since back in all the way back in 2004, when Massachusetts started down the road to legalizing gay marriage and compelling others to recognize that. Very quickly, religious adoption agencies were driven out because they could not and would not submit to that new definition. And so there's a duplicity here, and maybe less so now because it seems like a lot of the activists have recognized the full import of their claims, the full impact, and they've realized, actually we are going to have to compel religious people to knuckle under. And I wonder if many of them didn't have this in mind all along. It's like Rod Dreher says with his law of merited impossibility. It's impossible that my gay marriage could ever affect your religious freedom. And when it does, you're going to deserve it good and hard. It's that's kind of the attitude it seems to be.
What I find so interesting is that's how much of the lingo, the rhetoric of contemporary society is about tolerance, is about love, is about, love is love, love wins, all these things. It's all about being anti-bigotry, being anti-hatred. I think it was Jack Phillips was saying within 20 minutes of the rejecting the request to participate in the gay marriage by doing the cake, within 20 minutes, he was getting death threats. He was getting all sorts of, I hope they bring the lions back for you people. All these things, desiring someone's death, all in the name of tolerance and love. And it's one thing if someone is a racist, if someone is someone who just hates other people. It's one thing when they say that, because you expect them to say that. It's completely consistent with what they're doing. It's awful, but it fits. But they're so quickly, the comments turn to bigotry and hatred and things like that. Ironically, in fighting against hatred, they practice hatred. In fighting against bigotry, all Christians are like this. And there is something off in there. And I don't know, man, that's an interesting question. Did people who advocate this think the matter through? I think probably some of them did. I think some of them knew where it was going to go. But I think it just shows part of the shallowness of the American worldview at the moment. It's kind of a broad monotheism, but it's God is Santa Claus, that God is this loving father figure up in the sky kind of thing, and he wouldn't hurt a fly. And so when you have that, all of a sudden Christians come along and say, no, you can't do that. That sounds like hatred. And they immediately, the anger comes out. It's the rootlessness of their thought. So there's probably a bit of both. There's probably people who did think about it, know what's going on. I think that the fact that so many people changed from, the stats on 20 years ago on gay marriage to now, that shows how shallow I think America's thinking were. Even if you think that gay marriage is right and transgenderism is right, the fact that Americans shifted so quickly means there were not a lot of roots in place.
Well, it seems like to me the shift was largely accomplished on this sort of promise that we just want to love who we love. We just want to get married. Don't you want that sort of Stepford ideal for gay people, just like for you? Why would you deprive your neighbors of that? And that was the ideal it was sold under. I think since then, we're talking about this as if it's, in somewhat hopeless terms. And it can sound that way, but it's really not. And Jack Phillips especially, but Barronelle as well through her perseverance, and then ADF is taking up a number of other cases that are inevitably going to wind up at the Supreme Court, which just overturned Roe v. Wade. So we're here in a sort of legally hopeful situation, because it looks like these claims that religious people need to just knuckle under and do the bidding of the new ideology have been swatted down pretty consistently by the courts. And then there's been this overreach on the cultural level where we are now pretty much a decade into the whole rollout of transgenderism. I mean, how long has it been since Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn Jenner and posed on the cover of the magazine? This is now a fully fledged, fully rolled out campaign. And I see a lot of revulsion to some of the extreme manifestations, like drag queen story hour and hormones and mastectomies for little kids, and the public transitioning of minors, things like that. I sense this growing tide among Americans of, well, hang on. We didn't sign up for this, guys. We just wanted you to have your happy gay marriage. It wasn't going to affect any of us. What is this? I mean, where are you going with this? It's too early to say, of course, but I have this inkling that the hand may have been overplayed, and that the mantra of tolerance has long since run out of gas. That now it is very clear much more was being demanded than was advertised. And this is a much more aggressive and all-consuming movement. I mean, we just got through Pride Month, right? June is Pride Month, and every year it gets more in your face, more obnoxious. And I just wonder if I think there's some objective measures of this, especially in countries in Europe where they've sort of put a stop or pumped the brakes on transitions for minors and things like that. But I wonder if there is a growing recognition that, hey, this is not what we were promised. This is not how this was sold. There actually is coercion coming to bear on our lives here and on the lives of little kids, and we don't like it.
Yeah, I think that the European example is actually very key, because particularly Britain, there's lots more conversations about that. I mean, and Britain is not exactly a stalwart of conservative Christianity as it once was, perhaps, but there's lots of talk about how this is not a good idea in much more mainline papers that you wouldn't have. That this just doesn't happen except in places like the Colson Center and places kind of niche, specifically Christian organizations. You do have more of a conversation there. And the fact that so many of these Scandinavian socialist states that so many people like to praise is the future way to do things, they put a stop on all these sorts of things. And I think that there's an opportunity, because I don't think it's just that middle of the road conservative Americans are recognizing the issue. I think that there's even an opportunity, even with people who are kind of secular, even pro-homosexuality issues. I have some friends who they have a couple of friends who they are hairdressers, and they're two male hairdressers with every stereotype you can think of with two male hairdressers. They are a couple. But the thing is, this is several years ago now, when the whole Chick-fil-A controversy was going on, was all in the news. Well, when all those protesters showed up at Chick-fil-A, they showed up at Chick-fil-A too and went in and bought stuff, because they said, if they can shut down Chick-fil-A, if Chick-fil-A is pushing against the cultural trends, they can shut us down too. They recognized what, the pluralistic, what liberty really meant. That if the state gets to decide, if social pressure from certain groups are managed to get control of the arms of state bureaucracy, they can shut down whoever they want if you step out of line. So I think that there's an opportunity there too. I think that for folks like you and I, some of our best next steps to educate the church. I mean, because I think so many people, I get responses not from wishy-washy Christians. Okay, you expect people who are kind of wishy-washy. They go to church once a month. They're the creasters. They're less than once a month.
Creasters being a portmanteau of Christmas and Easter.
Yes, there we go. Yeah,
I've never heard that before. That's great.
Oh yeah, it's a good one. But you kind of expect that they're not in on it. But I've had several well-informed, well-meaning Christians who refer to Jack Phillips as that guy who won't serve gays. And he needs to go do it. Or even other people say, well, if you're going to have a business, you're going to have to sell to everybody. In that case, it's not an ignorance. It is an ignorance. It was a failure to recognize what the real issue was. That there was more than, again, I think it was Barronelle Stutzman said, there was such a silly comment to say that she's the woman who won't serve gays, because the very guy that led to the court case was a regular customer for 10 years. So that people don't recognize what's going on. I think that we need to recognize, to clarify the misstatements that so much of the world and the mainstream media say, and also to highlight to Christians what the real cost is if you force people to state these messages. So I do think there's hope. There's a lot of work ahead of us. I think that these court cases, this Coach Kennedy thing that was actually referenced in that conversation, I think that gives us some wiggle room. But we've got to do the work now. We've got to do the work of informing ourselves and helping to inform our neighbors and church people around us.
Well, Tim, thanks so much for joining me today. This has been a great conversation, very helpful, and I'm glad that we could unpack some of the further dimensions of this whole discussion I had with Jack and Barronelle. I want to give a special shout out also to the folks at Alliance Defending Freedom, especially Matt Sharp, who joined me with Jack and Barronelle for that conversation. They've really made it possible for folks like Jack and Barronelle to stand up for the little people who can't afford a decade of legal proceedings to stand firm in the face of ideological bullying. And that's exactly what Jack and Barronelle were able to do thanks to the help of ADF. And they've established, because of that, a growing body of legal precedent that makes it possible for people like Jack and Barronelle to stand up and stand on their convictions in the way they run their businesses and the way they live their lives. And otherwise, that just wouldn't be possible in the face of powerful left-leaning organizations like the ACLU and so forth. So thanks to the folks at ADF. Thank you, Tim, for joining me again for further Upstream. This was a wonderful discussion.
Sure. Happy to come.